What's up guys, my name is Robert. I am a logo and brand identity designer and brand strategist from Perth, Australia. This is the second video in the series I'm making about personal branding, breaking down my whole process of personal branding, why I decided to rebrand. If you want to get insight into more like the strategic part of it, kind of figuring out what I'm about as a brand and determining whether or not kind of the right decision to rebrand, then definitely check out part one, which I'll link in the description or at the end of this video. But in this video, basically I'm going to be breaking down my process with creating the actual logo, going from conceptual ideas in the kind of discovery strategy phase into sketching and how I kind of approach the sketching into the digital realm and kind of creating the logo, and then from there kind of building out the rest of the identity around it. So yeah, it should be really interesting for you guys. I think if you're kind of looking to create your own logo, hopefully you'll learn a lot from this process and be able to follow along from some of the insights that I'm offering along the way, hopefully. So yeah, without further ado, we'll get into it and see you on the sketchpad. So I'm going to do my best to go in chronological order of the pages that I did. I don't really go in a chronological order though, because I tend to, when I need to trace, I jump onto a new page and then there's still page space left on the other page and I jump back around. So that's kind of how I work, I guess. But nevertheless, so here you go, personal brand. I just wrote that there. I drew my old one for reference there, and I did, sometimes I kind of jump in with a bunch of these little thumbnail sketches and whatnot. I think the main idea I was exploring here is kind of like, again, an integration of the R and the N. So you have here like the N, and then it's an R when it's this way. So it's like that idea of like looking at something from different perspectives and getting something different out of it. It's kind of interesting idea, I think. This one here looks a bit rubbish, but again, it's the same thing. Like, I mean, this looks like a Z, right? But I was thinking you could make an R and an N with the same shape, potentially. And I was also exploring the idea here, like this is you can tell that's an R because it has the rounded curve to it. But you could also flip that and use that as an N, and it would look quite the same. So it's, yeah, a bit of an interesting idea, but it doesn't actually look good. And the next page is probably this one. You can see my sketching is pretty messy. I don't follow like a very linear process with it. I kind of just go with the flow, chuck a podcast on or some music. Yeah, this one here, I was looking at the idea of like an ink trap sort of thing. I don't really know what that was about. I have found this really flowery looking typography that I liked, so I was experimenting with that idea with like an R. And the same here, like this is, again, you know, I was talking about that idea of like really abstract, random looking, old school typography. I found something that I liked like that. But the problem is this only really looks good when you have a whole word in it, and that gives you a bit more context, whereas just the one, it sort of just looks a bit jank. And again, here's some different ideas with the same thing. I was like, oh, I might as well kind of explore a subtle rebrand of the RN thing. So I kind of like this like diagonal line happening here was a bit interesting, but ultimately didn't really lead anywhere. This shape, I really like that shape. You'll kind of see how that expands throughout the process. The next page was this one. So you'll see I'm kind of bringing, I really like this undulating shape here. It's almost like a kind of river or something. It just had a really nice feel to it, you know, and I think sometimes you just got to trust that feel to an extent. So I was kind of experimenting with that a little bit more. And I quite like this idea of like overlapping, or like the, you know, you kind of have these two almost lines that follow the same shape, making the R, if that makes sense. So you can have the over line and then the line that goes there. So I'm really basically deconstructing the form of an R and seeing how can I make this into something interesting, derivative, unusual. That's kind of how I'm approaching it. The next page, here is where I'm really starting to get into the swing of it a bit more. I had this one here, so I colored that one in, which I thought was kind of nice. It's maybe a little too abstract again. I don't know if this was connection. Oh, this was actually not related to this project at all. Don't worry about that. This just shows you how I like to have pages and I just write things on them. I don't know. Certain part of the creative process you've got to be structured, and then a certain amount you've got to be very free. And for me, sketching is kind of the free part of the process. So yeah, that was kind of playing off on the last page what you saw. And again, I'm just redrawing the shape. Like if I don't know what I'm doing, I kind of just draw what I'm liking and start just picking it apart and playing with it and seeing it in new ways and what that leads to. So I really like this as being kind of like the leg of the R. That was something I was really liking. So I had this idea of, you kind of see it throughout these ones, of sort of two lines, you know, very similar, one going straight and then one taking a kind of curved path, and then this almost becomes, you know, this line is like that part of the R, and then that is that part of the R, you know. So it's a very abstract looking R. I was a bit worried though this was too flat and it doesn't really get that impression across. So I had some different variations here where there's another sort of brick on top and one there. This one here, which I actually don't mind, it's kind of nice. You can sort of see it a bit clearer there. And then I tried this being a bit thicker. That wasn't really working because I kind of wanted these two to feel analogous, to feel like they are of the same creed. I don't really know if that makes sense, but in the next one it might make sense as well. I was thinking maybe I could make it look more like an R by joining it up here, but then that just becomes sort of a 2, which is obviously suboptimal. And then we have this here, and then there's another page which is kind of done at the same time as this one. Had some more ideas. This R is kind of an interesting shape, but it's a little bit too random looking, I suppose. Yeah, some more things happening there. But yeah, really I was pretty much sold on this idea of the R. Something around this or this. This one was a little bit too wide, but I still really liked it. And I'll explain why. I was looking at it, what it might be like in different colors. But the idea is that it's almost like going back to my idea of courage. It's this idea of like there's one path, you know, like the expected path, and then there's the deviating path. There's like the courageous path. It's like standing out. It's kind of going your own way a little bit. And I just loved the metaphor behind that, you know. And as I was saying earlier, there's that idea of, you know, of logos that have multiple layers of meaning to them, and that was something I really liked because not only did it speak to me in kind of just the form of it, like it's really simple. It's simple, but it's audacious, you know, it's bold. And that's not always an easy thing to find because a lot of simple forms, they're sort of already taken, you know, since someone's already using them in some way for a logo. So it's quite hard to find one that is bold and different, but also simple. So it's simple and bold, but then it also has some like extra level of depth and meaning behind it. So pretty much that is what I rolled with going into the digital phase, and we'll see what that looks like now. Okay, welcome to the time-lapse portion of the video. So as you can see here, I've jumped in, I've chucked the sketch on a layer underneath and then jumped over the top. So I started with kind of rectangular shapes that ultimately didn't end up working, so I went with kind of lines instead. That way I could get the flow right, basically. It's an easier way to work with. So right now I'm kind of trying to get that magic of the sketch back, and then I jump in here, basically deviate from the sketch completely and do a whole bunch of variations. I just copy it over and over and over again and make different little tweaks, some different ideas there. And yeah, now we're jumping into color, some initial experimentation, which I'll jump into later on. I quite like the idea of the pink just for the contrast, and it kind of has this like CMYK kind of magenta and blue look. And then I'm jumping into the typography. I already had a pretty good idea of what I wanted. I wanted an R that had a similar shape to it, so I could bring that curvature through. Went with a grandeur here, so I'm experimenting with the weight of the type a little bit to kind of get it looking right. And then I'm customizing it, so converting to outlines and then using this R kind of curvature to bring in that same element from within the logo, so they feel married, you know, they feel like they're speaking the same language. Doing that with kind of logo types and word marks is just really nice, ties it all together. Same thing with the N, experimenting with the N quite a bit actually, trying to get it exactly right, trying to get that curvature how I wanted it. And then the W, you'll see later on, I kind of tortured myself with this W. The A, I did something interesting with the A, but it didn't really like work in context. I think if it were just the type, it'd be sort of nice, it'd be a nice little detail, but it's just way too attention grabbing, draws attention away from, you know, the logo as a whole. It kind of becomes distracting, so that wasn't the way to go. But we have now we have the W again. Jumping back into the W, trying to get some curvature in there because it felt like it's just a little bit too geometric. But I ultimately decided against any of these W variations and just kept it stock standard. Sort of a lesson in there, but it's good to try these different things and see how they go, you know. Even if they don't turn out, you can at least give them a fighting chance, you know. So here's me trying to make the W thinner because I thought, oh well, it's a little bit too wide in the logo, blah, blah, blah. Yeah, decided against that ultimately. Trying to see how different variations within the word mark look in terms of width, and that ultimately didn't work. And then I think I experimented with the kerning a little bit here, which I ultimately changed after this screen recording. Then I changed to this like really dark deep blue, which I actually liked a little bit better, and it's similar enough I think that brand recognition is still there. And I played with some different ways of kind of locking up the logo, having this idea of the path going into the words Robert and Nowland. Here I am with this pink color again. I like the idea of the pink, again, contrast, and it's sort of the gradient suggests like a bit of a journey happening there. Here I am experimenting with the N, which is quite interesting, but again, it didn't add that much, and so, you know, if it doesn't add anything, then it needs to be removed. Basically, that's logo design in a nutshell. Anyway, that's about it. So from there, I decided to play more with the colors because it felt like placeholder colors that I liked, but I always like to put that extra time in to really get them 100%. So I kind of go through and compare different colors that look basically identical on first inspection to one another. This was the original one here. You can see there when you look at it in comparison to the others, it's too purple. Yeah, that's basically it. It's too purple. It's got that kind of violetness to it. I wanted it to be a bit more magenta, a bit more closer to red than to purple. Yeah, this is the final one I went with here. So it's a bit more red in it, but it's still pink, like these ones here where it was very red. It's kind of a different vibe that I'm not quite going for. So this is really what I liked here. And what I like too about that is it's kind of like, here we go, I've just drawn that. So to me, this is like, what I like about these colors is they're quite similar to the kind of colors you get in this sort of you know, red, green, blue pixel type thing. So it sort of speaks to the, you know, what I do, I guess, which is like very digital in nature. Using those paint bucket colors, you've got a very similar color, not very similar, but you got a similar color here with like the magenta and the blue. You know, they're just those really bold, like standard colors. So yeah, that kind of became this. And the reason I had this gradient along the bottom one is that it's sort of, again, it's that idea of like breaking off, of like going into the light, into the unknown, that I really loved. Final logo is basically as you see here, which I think is pretty sick. Now, the next step from there was, now that I kind of have an idea of what my logo is going to look like, obviously there's hours and days and stuff feeding into this process, then I wanted to start thinking about, okay, you know, how can I start implementing this logo as a full-on holistic identity, so it's more than just the logo, because your brand is a lot more than the logo. Obviously it's color scheme, it's typography, it's all that good stuff as well, you know, but it's how the brand really appears as a whole, and I wanted to make sure that that was really strong, because from the beginning last time I didn't bring that into consideration, so I wanted to make sure that this time I did. And the way I did that basically is I kind of imagined like a carousel template for Instagram. That was one area where I felt like I was really lagging. All my carousels looked very different and I just wasn't in love with that. So I thought, how would this translate into a visual identity for things like carousels and Instagram posts and all of that fun stuff? So I just made like okay, let's imagine that I'm making a carousel about making your goals stick. How might that look as a template? So I had, you know, this idea that I really liked at the top here. I was like, oh, you could use this kind of behind. It's like a little highlight. Didn't end up going with that. Just some different ways of interpreting this idea of the kind of adjacent lines that are breaking off from one another. This I thought was like a nice little tab that you could use to like show swiping action, which I think I'm going to use. And yeah, more and more different ideas here. I had this idea of like, what about throughout the template you had throughout the length of a carousel, you know, it's kind of a gradient transition along the bottom there. And yeah, some different ways of doing the gradient. This one's kind of nice, don't mind that actually. Ended up using that a bit differently further on, as you'll see. Different ideas. I think this is what I prefer, this idea of like the underline versus this highlight behind, it just looks a bit cleaner, and I think is more aligned with what I'm about. I also think this slightly less chunky type is probably better for a title like that. But I was just playing around with it a bunch, like how could I use these lines to kind of make different interesting compositions. So I'm really liking this idea of the lines. I think that was a huge insight from it. You know, the logo feeds into the idea of the lines. The lines, they become this whole graphic element that you can really just go wild with. And then I thought, okay, let's kind of use this same gradient as like a background. If you wanted to have like a colored background versus a white background, and you could bring the undulating lines in as white, and I think that's pretty cool as well. So again, that's further diversity of execution for the brand. And I think you could also do just like a real, you know, for one slide in there, if you really wanted to make a point, you could just use, bang, here's the pink, here's the blue. It's just a little bit ugly, but I kind of like that look of like just a tiny bit, like it sort of knows that it's ugly, it's self-aware and that it's ugly, but it's not exactly ugly, it's just really like, ah. Hopefully I'm making sense to people. Yeah, you get the idea. And then I found all these, I found some of these on Unsplash, which are kind of sick, and I thought maybe I could start using this sort of thing, these like paint in water and stuff. This one is kind of cool. I think maybe the others are, you know, I don't want to go too much in this route. And then here is me experimenting with like this gradient again in some different scenarios with potentially some typography, which I think is actually kind of cool. I wanted this to look almost like a neon sign, but it starts to get a little bit too kind of like poppy, should I say? You know, kind of pop culture-y, or like, you know, want to be trendy sort of thing. I actually quite like this one here. More ideas here with the lines, and how I could use those. So potentially some type weaving in and out around that. I think that's a pretty cool idea. And like type going along the length of the lines. So you can really imagine how if I had a long carousel post, these lines could just, you know, go wild and like play around throughout it. So I'm really keen on that. Different ideas. I don't really know what that was. You know, you could kind of use this gradient again in some more interesting ways here. And then this line is like a little bit more kind of elegant, playful, undulating, which I think there's something to that as well. And then I was starting to look at like treatment of images and stuff, you'll see. So this is like basic stuff that I might want to use for carousel posts or any particular graphic thing. So I made kind of a little template of what that arrow would look like. And then here again, we have this idea of the lines and kind of contour. That's the word I was trying to think of the other day. Contour lines, and the radiating and in different colors. And I thought you could make really nice, interesting backgrounds for posts using that as well. So make your goal stick. You could always have it like it's sticking to whatever this white mass is that's emerged. White mass. That's not something I want to think too hard about. Here I'm looking at like treatment of images. So if there's a particular way that I could treat images that would be really distinctive. And what I came to ultimately was like these three down the bottom here. I wanted something I could do really easily in Illustrator without having to jump into like Photoshop, which is obviously more complex. So basically what I had here, like this one, you'll see I've got pink in darken blend mode, and then so yeah, darken and then lighten for the blue. So what that does on a black and white image is kind of gives you this like two-tone look with the pink and the blue. And I think you could also use just the blue, or you could use just the pink, or you could use the pink on the with black, because black is obviously going to be a color that's used in my branding as well. So yeah, there you go. That's how that might look on a post, something like that, right? Which is kind of nice. And if you look at that relative to my Instagram feed, prior to Instagram instigating all of this stuff, you can see that there's a much richer sense of like visual identity. It's much bolder, it's much clearer. So I'm really, really loving that. So yeah, there you go. Basically that was the whole branding process. I hope that was interesting to you, kind of get some insights on how I approached it, why I decided to do it, how things changed, and how I decided to realign more with what I'm about as a brand. So yeah, if you have any questions about any of that, let me know down in the comments below. Any other videos you want me to make, or if you want me to unpack anything there in more depth, definitely love to hear about that. So yeah, love y'all, appreciate y'all.